You did, yeah. I asked Earl to not schedule me right first thing in the morning. So, first of all, I want to apologize. My voice is a little hoarse because, yeah, talking over the din. Dan, there's space in the front here if you want.
What's that?
You want to see? There's a chair in the front. And we can.
Well, you can pack them in, can't you?
Yeah, I guess. Oh, sorry. You want to grab one of these chairs?
I'll grab a chair.
Just watch out for the cable here. It's to my laptop. You want to sit up here with me?
No.
All right, yeah, anyways, this is my, how many VCFs have I gone to now? This is my, let me start the timer so I don't go over, because everyone knows if you watch my channel, I like to talk. This is my third VCF, and every time by Sunday, I can't talk anymore. So maybe next time I give a talk, I'm going to have to ask them to move it up. That way I can get my voice out. Anyways, so first off, let me thank you all for coming. And I want to introduce myself, Adrian Black, if you aren't familiar, and probably, is there anyone here who doesn't regularly watch my channel? Okay, so we got a few. Okay, because when I was making this presentation up, and I have never given a presentation in front of people before, so I wasn't quite sure of like how much background to give, and I didn't want to like, my viewers are going to be like, I already know all this, but for the folks who don't know, I run the YouTube channel, Adrian's Digital Basement. I have a couple channels, that and the second channel is just called That Too, and I have about 170-something thousand subscribers on the main channel, and my second channel has about 50-some thousand. I live in Portland, Oregon. I was not born and raised there. I'm from Montreal originally, moved to California, grew up there, then I moved to Oregon about 11 years ago. And yeah, I make this channel, and it's purely as a love project. Like, I just love doing it. And actually, some news, if you aren't patrons on my Patreon, I recently quit my job, and I do this full time. So that's a big step for me. Yeah, I mean, it's funny in a way. I've been doing this for maybe, I think I put notes here. I don't know. I started, back in, well, this channel's existed all the way back till 2011. I had random crap videos on there. But I just started fixing broken computers and playing with this old stuff. I won't call it junk. I don't want to hurt anyone's feelings, but playing with this old stuff on the YouTube channel. And I figured out I really loved it. And I mean, I'll talk a little bit more about how I do this, or like why I got into it and stuff. But yeah, the quitting the job thing was a big deal for me. And yeah, it's kind of scary in a way to be reliant on YouTube income. I'm sure if everyone, is an internet citizen here, of how YouTube can decide to cancel your account or whatever at a whim's notice. So that is a little scary. But anyways, yeah, doing this full time, and yeah, as of July 1st, actually. So anyways, okay. So, what was that? Yeah, that's funny in a way. And I'm from Canada originally, and Canadian Independence Day is July 1st. So Canada Day. So I can always remember Canada Day as the day that I changed my career, and I will talk about what I did and stuff in a little bit. But anyways, okay. So those of you who've been watching the channel a long time, I had random stuff, like I said, a long time ago, and then I started doing light bulb teardown videos. And that was around 2015. And the funny thing is there's people I run into, and they're like, I've been watching you since then. And I don't even know why anyone watched my light bulb teardown videos, but I think I got the idea from maybe Big Clive, if you've ever seen his channel. But one of my light bulb teardown videos has like 450,000 views. And this is like from the old days, right? Before I was, it was just called Adrian Black, the channel. And that was sort of like what kind of kicked it off. But let's talk about a little bit about my history here, because this is not stuff I don't talk about that much on the channel. So you guys get a little background of how I came to be who I am today. So that is me in 1979. I was a normal 70s kid. That's me in the front, that is. Doing the old like shaggy hair in the 70s and riding my bike, and that would be around Montreal. And I had no idea what a computer was at that point. I mean, we'll have a story of like how we got into computers, right? And at that point in my life, I didn't even know I never touched or seen or anything to do with computers. I was just a free loving kid and riding my bike. But that's a picture of me. So I'm there, the little kid there on the left. In 1981, my father opened a video store in Montreal, or maybe it was in 1980. I don't remember the exact year. It was called Avenue Video. And the thing about that store, and you can see above the woman's head in the middle, they have like a VCR on a poster there. Back then, people didn't have VCRs, right? That was like the very early days of that stuff. So they actually sold hardware. So my father had like a relationship with a distributor. And in the video store, they had a wall full of hardware, but he started selling video games. And I think he rented them actually. So they had like ColecoVision and Atari 2600 and a whole wall of games. Well, of course, this was near our house. And after school, like I don't know what, I mean, I was probably I was 6 at that point. So I don't know what grade you're in kindergarten or first grade or whatever. I would go after school and I knew all the staff. Like, could they look any more 80s, those people? But they were really nice. And I used to go hang out in the video store after school and sit there at the front counter. They had a little, high chair, stool kind of thing. And I would play video games. And that was my first experience ever playing any games. And my father would, come in and he wasn't always working at the store. He had his staff doing that. But he would come in and see me playing with the stuff. And he's like, he seems to really enjoy this video game thing. And, a lot of parents would be like, oh, maybe I'll just get him a video game console. He'll be fine. What my father decided to do is use his hardware connections to buy me a Commodore Vic20. And he got it wholesale, through his connections. And that was an inflection point for me. When you think back in your life and, what could have happened to change the path of your life forever, this was it. That's me in 1983, so a couple years later. I got that computer in 1982 when I was 7. That's me using my VIC-20. There's a little data set there with some cassettes. I know it's hard to see on this projector here. A little 5-inch color TV there. And that was down in my dad's office. He was, by this point, had sold his video store, and he was a graphic designer, which was what he had always done. That video store was a little bump in the road, so to speak, for him. So I was, sitting next to his desk there, and so he would work from home. And it was kind of cool because he was there. I'd come home from school, and I'd be down on my computer. And you guys all know this. If you had a computer back then, you weren't, I had a few games, but I was really programming. I would go through the excellent Commodore manual and type in those basic programs, and I would write my own games, and all I had was this data set, and he bought me some learn how to program, there was a binder full of tapes inside, and I used to just love that. I loved that computer so much. And I don't have more, I have more pictures, but I didn't want to put them too many in here, but there's pictures of me. I had a little Commodore carrying case for that machine, and I would go visit my grandparents, and I would bring the computer, a little RF modulator, plug it into the back of their TV, and I was, turning into a little nerd kid. And this really was the inflection point that set me off to where I am today, actually, but my entire career as well. My dad, he made the right decision there, and I don't know where my life or what my life would be like if it wasn't for this. So here's me in 1986, just a few years later, and I had a VIC-20. I had an Apple IIc there. So very soon I realized the VIC-20 was a great computer, but I needed a little bit more power, and my father as well. And so he ended up buying me this Apple IIc with the little monochrome monitor. And it had disk drive, and it had a modem, so I was BBSing at this point. And at this point, I was in 6th grade, and I had moved to California. So even though I grew up in Montreal, when I was 11, moved to California. And so I think this wasn't long after I'd moved there, but I really, really was into my 2C. And I had a little 300 baud auto dial modem, and I was all over these Los Angeles BBSs. And I knew to look in the phone book to make sure that the phone numbers I was calling wasn't long distance. You had to check the exchange, and okay, that's local, because otherwise I'd run up the phone bill. And if anyone did BBSing, you probably have one experience where you ran up the phone bill and your parents were really mad. So, that just continued on. And the funny thing is, if you watch my channel, obviously I fixed a lot of Commodores. Other than VIC-20, that is the only Commodore I ever owned in my entire life. So I never touched a 64 other than at a friend's house or something. And it's funny how I've really come to love the Commodore 64, but I think what really affected my life is that I wasn't just a one computer kind of person or one brand sort of person. I had an Apple II there. I was really into Commodore Amigas and Macs and all this other stuff. So, I love everything, and that's sort of comes across in my channel. this is not an actual picture of me or anything. I found this on the internet. But in 1990, which was in high school for me, I worked in a computer store. And I was 15, and I got a job, 15 and a half, whatever, the first year you can work in California, and I worked for minimum wage, putting together PCs. And at that point in my life, I had never touched an IBM PC in my life. The computers we had at home was like a Mac SE, and I had my 2GS at that point. But my friend was like, hey, I think this job would be good for you, and you'll learn quick. And I did. I went in there not knowing anything, and I was troubleshooting and building PCs. And that really kind of kicked off my ability to learn to start to troubleshoot problems. And of course, PC clones in 1990, that was just like swapping motherboards and stuff. You weren't like doing circuit level repair, which is what I do on my channel now. Well, you still have to use your brain to like kind of isolate and figure out what's wrong with your computer, right? But it was a good experience. And that just sort of like started leading me on this path of like where I was going. So 1993, a couple of years later, I entered college. I went to California Polytechnic University at Pomona, or Cal Poly Pomona, so in Southern California. I was in the computer science program. That was sort of like the logical decision for me, like what was I going to do with my life? And the reason why I'm talking about this, by the way, is people always ask me, like, what did you learn? How did you get to know what you know? Well, this is the story I'm telling. Studying computer science at this university, it was a science degree, so it was mainly like math and software development. So I learned a lot about programming. Ironically, the language they were teaching back then was Ada. I'm not sure if anyone's ever heard of that. Certainly never used it for anything like good, but it was a good like structured language, like as a way to learn. It was multi-threaded and whatnot. But the entire campus ran on VAX VMS at that point. And that building with the pointy top there, they had like the main computers and stuff. So as a computer science major, of course, I was always logged into the VAX VMS. And it's funny because friends of mine who went to school with me always remember logging in, and they could see my username at the top because it was AC Black was my username. My middle initial is Craig, or middle name is Craig. So they're like, oh, AC Black, he's always logged in, that's Adrian. But anyways, I learned a lot about VAX VMS, which I've immediately forgotten. And David has a microvax, or one of your VAX machines running, although it's not working right now, right? You have it off, but on display over there. And I was like, I don't remember anything. But I knew the VAX VMS inside and out. Anyways, so at this point, I was learning about software development. I love developing software. I think it's actually pretty fun to write software. But it's definitely not something I've ever done, like ever after college. I never had a job writing software. But what I didn't have in school is any electronics classes whatsoever. Studying computer science, that is just not anything you do. But I had a roommate while I was in college who was in electrical engineering, was studying to do that. And I remember going like, hey, can I come to one of your labs, and crash your lab? And he's like, sure. So I went in, and the professor was like totally cool with that. I mean, I'd never done anything with electronics. And I got to play around with like oscilloscopes and stuff. That was the very first time. In fact, I think I have a picture right here. Oh, no, that's not the right one. All right, well, anyways. No, that's coming up later. But anyways, yeah, so I played with oscilloscopes. Anyways, okay, so moving on from there, I never graduated from school. And this was a state school, so it was like pretty inexpensive back in the 90s, compared to what college costs today for your kids. Yeah. So I was working full-time while going to school. And so that job I had in high school I was talking about, I kept doing that. But then I moved on to a better job, and I worked for the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, which ironically also had VAX VMS as that was what ran the entire museum, and all the employees used WordPerfect on DEC VT220 terminals. So I used my experience that I learned in school here with that to have this job. So I was doing that and commuting. It was about 30 miles from where I lived, and it was really difficult. And I remember talking to my advisor, and I was just like, this is tough. Like, I'm driving a lot, and LA traffic sucks, kind of like in Atlanta here. And he's like, well, if your job is good, and I have students that decided to go away, leave school and come back later if you want to finish your degree. Well, I left school, and I never finished my degree. Yeah. So I have a high school diploma, and that's that. Not even like a associate's degree or anything. But I went on from there to a long career. Not in hacking, but I wanted to find the most ridiculous picture. I entered the IT field, like that job at the LA County Museum of Art doing IT. I went from there to a bunch of different companies, and I worked for a company called Live Nation Entertainment for 23 years. They own Ticketmaster and whatnot, so if you've ever seen a concert in the US, you would have gone to one of our venues for sure. I was in the IT department. I've had many, many jobs there. I ran network engineering teams, telecom teams, and then for the last 10 plus years, I've been in information security. And when I left my job, I was a vice president, so I didn't actually like do anything anymore. I just told people what to do. But I was really lucky to be able to do a job like that paid really well, and I was very lucky to have an amazing team I worked with. Like, even though I've left my job, as I mentioned, I do miss the people I worked with. I literally love the team that I had, and I loved my boss. I worked for our CISO, the Chief Information Security Officer, and they're amazing people that I will be in contact with for the rest of my life. But on the other hand, what was happening is the YouTube stuff started, and I was like, well, I love my job, but I also love this old computers in my basement, so I'm gonna leave the job and just do this full time. And I've already started to the Dell star all of the knowledge I had from all these jobs. But of course, I still do think about information security from time to time. But it was a fun job, and if anyone works in InfoSec, it's interesting to be woken up in the middle of the night because of some incident, and all hands on deck. And I know that Zoom has a 24-hour time limit, and it will kick everyone off, because I've been on Zoom calls that lasted 3-4 days. We were taking shifts. Anyways, so at that point in my life, let's just say, not now, but while I was doing these IT jobs, my life was uncluttered. My basement was a basement. Had clothes in there, some boxes, just stuff like that. In fact, here's a picture of my workbench in 2012. That's it. And I did ride a motorcycle at the time, hence my helmet there, but I literally have some clothes hanging there. And I have an old analog scope there that I bought after fooling around with the scope in my friend's lab in college, going this is kind of cool. And then I bought a Rigol, whatever, that old one there. And this was because at the time, I was playing around with Arduino stuff. In fact, it's funny because Arduino really, I think it was designed as an education tool, right, to kind of get people interested in electronics. And that's exactly what it did for me. It made me realize, hey, this stuff is really fun, actually. And I ended up, I just bought that surplus equipment there, basically, but it's enough to kind of fool around with Arduino stuff. And that's it. This is all I was doing. All of my love of the old computers, I held on to none of it. I had nothing. I had no old machines left. All those machines from over the years, gone, long gone. And I moved up to Portland. I had a few things stored away in my apartment before I moved there. And even that stuff, I was just I'm going to let it go. I wanted to live a kind of uncluttered life. So there's that light bulb video, by the way, that I was talking about. So that's the kind of stuff I was doing down there in the basement, with my lab set up there. So I'd just sort of have a camera on a tripod over my shoulder is the simplest stuff. And it was a camera that was a hand-me-down. And this was one of those videos that made it $450,000. So that was in 2015. And then, around that time, a friend called. My oldest friend, Dave, he and I met in junior high school in 7th grade, and we've just been friends ever since. He still lives down in LA, but we chat all the time. He called me and he was like, hey, there's this person on Craigslist. And if you all remember Craigslist before Facebook Marketplace, there was someone selling a Dell it was a Micron, I don't know, multimedia PC from a Windows 95 type computer. And he's like, you should go get that. And I was like, I guess, I don't know, sure, it sounds fun. We were always talking about the old days, because who doesn't reminisce? Going wouldn't it be fun to have these old computers again? So I was like, okay, cool. So, next thing I know, it's in the back of my car. And it turned out an old lady owned this thing, and her husband had bought it for her, and they never used it. They had opened it, and it was 100% unused. And it was $60 or $70 or whatever that thing was. So that was my first haul, so to speak. I'm sure everyone is familiar with those are like. And here's another one that came later, and this was a free one. Now, I'm very lucky to live where I live. Portland, Oregon has tons of tech because Intel is huge there. Biggest employer in the state, to be honest. Tektronix, a lot of big tech companies. So there's a lot of engineering people who are getting old and needing to move out of their houses, and they're like, I need this stuff gone. So this was just a free thing I found on Craigslist, and then there's another one, me driving back, and there's a bunch of Commodore stuff in the back there, and yeah, so needless to say, the house started to fill up very quickly with all this retro stuff, and I was kind of getting excited about it. And that Micron PC, by the way, I made a video about that. So if you go on my channel, like way back to 2015 or 16 or whatever it is, there's some super cringy videos of me unboxing and talking about this old computer and stuff. And I had no real clue on, you know, what it's like to make videos at that point. This was completely just like, oh, let me just try doing this. I soon realized, though, as the house was filling up with retro stuff, I had a reality check. Everything was broken. Like, a lot of it was broken, and it didn't work. And at that point, having just played around with Arduinos, I had no skills in fixing anything. None. I mean, keep in mind, I don't have a date on there, but, you know, this was around, I don't know, like around that time in the 2016s. No clue on how to fix anything. And in fact, other than Arduino, that's my entire experience with electronics. And if anyone ever had one of those when they were a kid, you know, if you're not familiar with this, it's from Radio Shack. This particular one I had, my dad got it for me. You could like bend those springs and put wires in between the different components based on what's in the little book it came with, and make a radio. And there's a little like horrible crystal earpiece thing there. You could make an AM radio, you know. So I remember playing with that thing and enjoying it. But I don't know, I never really went anywhere with that. Like, I didn't like try to make my own circuits. I just did the stuff in the book. That is literally my entire experience. So this was a slide I was supposed to talk about the oscilloscope in the school thing where I talked about that, so we'll skip over that. And this is the Arduino stuff. This is what I said I was playing with, but to be honest, if you've ever used an Uno, it's a good thing it has a replaceable microcontroller, because I broke many a microcontroller by, you know, too much current on a pin or putting it in backwards or whatever. So that really did its thing, and it started teaching me some of the most fundamental basics of electronics. So at that point, I knew I was kind of interested in wanting to learn more about how to work on these old broken computers. So I was really big into watching Dave Jones. In fact, I had already been watching it for a while. Like, that's why I had that Rigol scope, and that was back in 2012. And Dave has been making videos for a very long time. And in the old days, and like looking at his popular videos here, you know, he has a lot of tutorial type videos. In fact, just a little thumbnail at the bottom there, some of you may not be able to see, he's like, you know, which is the best cheap oscilloscope? And best multimeter, yeah. And like, so that's how I ended up like buying the things I had, but I barely knew how to use things. But watching channels like that, I really have to give him and other creators who were doing that stuff early on huge props. For me, Big Clive is another one. That really started me off on the journey that I'm on now. So this is like probably one of the other inflection points for me. First was that video store in the VIC-20, and then this, watching content on YouTube. And it's funny to think, at that point I never would have had any idea in my mind that I would ever be doing this like he is for a living. It still blows my mind to even think about it. And, you know, Dave's got almost 1 million subscribers. I took this screenshot just the other day. And, you know, he and I chat all the time. And he's a nice guy. And it's just weird to think. I never would have thought then that I would be here, well, A, talking to you guys, but B, knowing people like him. So anyways, it really got me started. And point being, literally what I do now is from watching these guys. Like, being able to do what I do is all from them. And so what I started doing, and I had never done before, is obviously learning how to read schematics. Like, the basics of doing all this stuff that I do, it really comes down to just understanding some fundamentals. And having access to schematics and being able to read that and make some sense of it means a lot. Like, that gets me going. Does anyone have any idea what this schematic is from, by the way? I know you can't read it.
The size of Earth?
No. Bonus points? No. Okay, well, anyways, it's from a Commodore monitor. If anyone knew that, I was like, super nerd, awesome. So anyways, yeah. I learned how to read those, and again, that was a lot of that coming from watching other repair channels, especially some of the old legacy channels. Let's just call them legacy channels, right? And I started realizing that doing repairs on these computers and starting to make things work again, it felt really good. And I would equate this to any kind of troubleshooting. It has nothing to do with like just the computers. But if you're a software developer and you have a bug that's driving you absolutely crazy, when you do find it, you might kick yourself because you're like, I made a stupid typo and that ruined my program. But I guess I've always really thrived off that feeling of fixing stuff. And before I was doing the repairs of the computers, you know, in our daily lives, you always have things you try to work on, right? And you fix it, it makes you feel good. But I was like, I feel a really big high. And in fact, the title slide of this presentation, right, was "It freaking works." And that is truly like, that's not just a tagline. I really feel that when I fix something. And even before I was doing the cameras, you know, I'm like, oh my God, it freaking works. Anyways, so I realized it felt good. I wanted to do more. So I was going to talk about this. This is from July 2018. And this is the first repair, circuit level repair in earnest that I ever did in my entire life. This was June 2018. So that's how recent this was. I bought this Commodore PET from a thrift store in Portland for $10. Not working, obviously. It was very dirty, school district computer, and that was what happened when you turned it on. And if you ever looked at a Commodore PET, Dan's got one at his booth here. You open the lid, it's just like a ton of TTL chips. And you know, where do you start with that, right? That's the kind of thing you're like, I don't even know. Like, this thing's doing this. It's like, what do you do with that? Well, what started happening was, first I reached out to the people on the VCF forums. So if you haven't familiar with the VCF forums and you're ever trying to fix something, they're a wonderful resource. And to be honest, they really, really helped me, because at that point I had never even used a PET or touched a PET. So I didn't understand like anything about its boot process or any of that stuff. So the folks over there were really nice to be able to kind of walk me through that. And it's funny to think now, right? I needed to be walked through the basics of troubleshooting back in 2018. And they were like, oh, you gotta like, you know, this is how the PET works. You have a universal board, blah, 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 all the technical details about this particular machine. Well, one of the things about this computer is that it has these ROM chips on it that are not just normal EEPROMs. You can't just replace a ROM. And there was a diagnostic ROM that exists for the PET that Commodore used in the manufacturing of these machines. And I was like, well, I'd like to get that ROM working, because maybe that'll give me a clue as to like what's wrong with this machine. Well, the thing is, like, it originally has this clip thing you clip on the CPU, and I guess now there's a thing you can plug into the CPU socket and you can run the diagnostic ROM, all this stuff. Anyways, I built a circuit, and this is using my very rudimentary, like, Arduino knowledge, and that's what's going on here. I built an EEPROM in an adapter with a circuit to replace the ROM chips on the motherboard to run the diagnostic code. And the people on VCF actually was kind of funny, because they were like, oh yeah, that's not going to work. You're going to have to buy the, you know, the clip thing. And I was like, that's really expensive, and I have extra money. So I built this, and it worked. And with that, I was able to start to get to the bottom of what's wrong with this machine. And it took a long time, everyone. Like, I don't want to, like, you know, I can fix machines really quickly now, and it was a very slow process. So that's how it started for me. And I think, you know, if you're kind of getting into this repair stuff, it's going to be that way too, where you're like, I don't know if I'm going down the right path. You're going to go down the wrong path like 50 times and then finally get to the right path. And there was a lot wrong with this computer. I remember there was like some like 6520s that were bad. There was bad RAM. There was some bad video RAM. I think like a TTL Logic chip or two were bad. But I got it. And I got that feeling. And, you know, in the end, I got a fully working PET, and it's a 4016. And to this day, actually, I keep that PET in my office at home as like a reminder to me of where I started. And I think the $10 for a PET is also really great because it's so cheap. But, you know, the guy was going to charge me more because he thought it worked, and he was looking at eBay. And then when I was like, well, let's turn it on and plug it in first. And we did it at the store, and it didn't work. And I was like, well, it's broken. And he's like, okay, how about $10? I'm like, sold. But anyways, yeah, I got that machine fully working, and to this day, it still works perfectly. But I felt so damn good fixing this computer. And I remember going back to the VCF folks, and I was like, thanks very much in the forums there. Thanks very much for the help. And that was it. And so no video was ever made about this, because even though I had made a few PC videos, like that Micron PC video was on there. I'd never done any troubleshooting on camera, which is interesting because troubleshooting on camera is different than doing it not on camera, because you're multitasking while you're recording, because you're trying to talk to your audience and multitask. So I make a lot more mistakes actually on camera, but I've gotten used to that, and I do include that stuff in my videos if I do make mistakes. But anyways, so here's what I've learned a little bit about repair, and this is where I don't want to be preachy or anything. I want to give a caveat. This is like what I figured out through these several years here learning how to troubleshoot, and it's the methodology that I use in fixing my computers. And of course, you all have computers, and they probably have broken ones. If you're going to learn to fix them, you can fix them however you want. I don't criticize anyone for anything they do, but anyways, that's my caveats. So, the Canon, the Parts Canon. I call this the Parts Canon. It's a term I borrowed from the car repair channels, because if you've ever had a car in for repair, it's a very typical way a lot of places fix cars now, is they just throw parts at it, meaning they plug their little diagnostic computer into the car and it says that, you know, you have this sensor's wrong. They're like, well, knew that, knew this, knew that, but they don't actually do the troubleshooting. They're just like following what the computer said, and half the time that doesn't work. And you end up with putting a bunch of parts into something that doesn't get you anything. You don't have it working. And Mike's nodding over here. He used to work on cars a lot. So
Customer still pays for it though.
yeah, I know. And then they send you away, your car still has the problem, and you have a bunch of new parts that you didn't even need. And they put junky new parts on your car, which aren't even as good as the original ones that were on there. Anyways, so it's very easy to fall into that same trap with computers. And you know, if you have a retro computer, like the PET as an example, the Parts Canon is actually a little dangerous for working on computers. And the reason why is that anytime you remove a chip from a board, you do risk damaging the motherboard. And if the board is all socketed, okay, well, it's a little less risky, because say you had like two same computers, one works, one doesn't, you know, you can try swapping parts around. But imagine you have like a one-off, you have a Commodore 64 as an example, and you don't have like two of them. You don't know anyone who has one, and everything is soldered on the motherboard. Like this particular, that's a 64 motherboard, obviously, and everything was soldered. Desoldering chips is a skill, and it's probably one of the honestly, for me in fixing stuff, it's easy for me now because I've done it a lot, but I would say that this is one of the hardest skills about trying to fix an old computer, because there is a big risk of making it worse. And I don't know if anyone's done any repairs in here, but like I've gotten computers where someone has worked on it before me, and unfortunately a trace was lifted or a pad was ripped and it was underneath another chip and you couldn't even see it. And that's why like the Parts Canon, I think, is a pretty bad idea on a computer. On a car, it's not as risky because you can unbolt things, put, you know, whatever. But when you're taking stuff off boards, every time you desolder or something, you do take a risk. And I have a video that I put online about how I desolder chips or how I remove chips from boards. In fact, this is a screenshot from that video. And my trick is to use hot air, which is the nozzle on the side there, and a desoldering iron. But the hot air thing is really cheap. But a good desoldering iron, like a Hacko, they're like $350 or whatever, and that's not chump change for, you know, if you're just repairing a one-off. So I really feel that it's super important to try to figure out what's the actual problem first before you remove any parts from the board. And I try to convey that in my videos. So like now that I'm making these videos, I spend a lot of time talking about the methodology that I use and trying to teach that about my troubleshooting process to everyone. Next thing, it's almost never the caps that are the problem. That has been my experience. It's okay, caveat is it's almost never the caps unless it is the caps. So I'm going to preface this by saying yes, like there's a whole slew of different types of caps here. I have, in all of the fixing I've ever done, and I have fixed hundreds of computers at this point, there have only been a couple times ever that there was a bad capacitor that caused the fault. And I don't mean like a refa. Like, you know, these go bad, you see them, you got to yank them out. And if you're working on a Mac or an Amiga and it's got those surface mount caps, you got to get them off the board. They're going to destroy the board. Point blank, right? There's no debate about that. But looking at this motherboard here, which I think is like a Mac SE or SE30 or whatever, it's got that axial 470 microfarad cap. I put the chance of that 470 cap being a problem for your computer at like 0.001%. It's like almost nothing. So in all the machines I've ever fixed, there's been like 2 or 3 where an actual electrolytic cap was the problem. And even in my like when I work on CRTs, which are filled with capacitors, only a couple times has it ever been a cap that was actually causing an issue. And I kind of, it's a funny thing because like people get pissed at me for this because I say, well, don't recap. So I think what I was saying is like, don't recap your stuff as a first step, because if you don't need to recap something because the caps work, you're risking possible damage to your computer. But the other thing is, for me personally, and keep in mind I focus on stuff from like the late 70s into the 80s, a little bit of the early 90s, that range of stuff, the electrolytic caps they used were super good quality. Into the late 90s, yeah, they turned to garbage, right? And then the cap plague, all that stuff, yeah, there's lots of issues on those machines. And stuff from the 50s and the 60s, yeah, those electrolytic caps and old TVs and in the early 70s, yeah, problematic. And there are other certain caps that are problematic. But those caps, like that Nichicon axial there, that's been on that board for like, 35 years or whatever it is. What's to say that's not going to last another 35 years and work perfectly? And if you put a new cap on there, what's to say that new cap is going to even last 10 years? Because I have stuff that I bought 10 years ago and this already has bad caps on it. So my personal feeling is that was like the golden age of capacitors, not the silver ones, but the electrolytics, where they are so darn reliable. Anyways, so I always say don't replace caps until you know for sure that the caps are a problem or you know they're going to leak, because every time you do, you risk damaging the board more. Other thing I learned is that an oscilloscope is the most essential tool you can possibly get. And depends on the kind of repairs you're doing, but I have to say that I don't think I would be able to do most of what I do without an oscilloscope. And the funny thing is about this one, which I actually did a review on my channel, I just buy random scopes occasionally just to try them out. That thing with $62 there is $34.88 in 1984. So can you imagine back in 1984 being able to buy a scope for 34 bucks? Back in the day, I don't even know what oscilloscopes cost in the 80s, but thousands and thousands of dollars, way beyond like the budget of any like hobbyist, like which is what we all are, right? Or at least what I am. But getting a scope and just fooling around with it is gonna get you so far. So I get a lot of questions on like, what are the good techniques to use? Get your scope, buy a cheapy one like that, plug it into your working computer, start probing around those signals, looking at how it should look. That's gonna kind of go a long way. Now it's funny because people ask me all the time, hey, can you give a tutorial on using scopes? I'm really hesitant to do that because I actually don't really know how to use them that well. I mean, compared to someone like Dave Jones, who's like an actual engineer, or anyone else who is trained on this stuff, I am like just this self-taught fool in a way that doesn't really know how to use this stuff. I only know it well enough for me. And all of those basic tools, right? So those things like, avoid Parts Canon, don't just swap parts randomly, but I alluded to this earlier. I think learning how something is working is going to give, how do I phrase this? This is a block diagram from a 2GS. It's a bad specific example. But when you look at this and you look at a fault that your computer has, it allows you to start to eliminate the things that aren't broken. And that's probably my single biggest piece of advice. This is the logical deduction and your reasoning skills. If you can look at a diagram or you understand how your, say, Commodore 64 works, what's working on there? And the reason why that's important is because it allows you to ignore those parts of the circuit and only focus on the parts that are possibly the area of the problem. Now, Earl in the back there has a 64 that he built himself that's not working right now, and I haven't looked at it, but here's a perfect example. I get people all the time, my 64 has a black screen. What's the problem? Well, unfortunately, there's a lot of potential issues, but the funny thing is that a black screen on a 64 actually tells you quite a lot about what's going on. And this is not the right block diagram. And I would have put a 64 one on here, but they were all the wrong orientation to work on the presentation, so I didn't put it on there. But on the 64, when you look at its block diagram and you look at the circuit design, once you've like realized how the schematics work, for it to generate a black screen that, you know, say you plug your LCD TV into it and then it's like a blue screen, you turn it on, it goes black, and you just have no signal. Well, it has a signal, but it's black. To get that, you have to actually have a bunch of things working in the machine. You need to have power, and you need to have 5 volts and 12 volts, well, in the older bread bins, because that's what the video chip needs, and you can see that in the schematics. You need to have a working clock signal, because the clock signal on the 64 generates the video signal that creates the sync pulses that the monitor uses. So even though it's a black screen and the computer's not seemingly telling you what's wrong with it, right away you're able to eliminate a bunch of things that are okay. So there's like some caps on a 64. Well, those caps are good because you have a nice solid black screen. You know, your VIC chip is probably okay, the graphics chip, because it's generating a video signal. It's just a black video signal. Your clock circuit works. You can ignore that entire timing section of the motherboard. Your power switch is working. You know what I mean? There's like a whole bunch you can rule out. And then you can start poking around to try to figure out where the problem might be. And if you kind of think logically, you're like, well, what does the 64 do when you turn it on? Okay, well, it's obviously generating a signal, black, but that's what it's doing by default. But then normally it starts executing its code out of the ROM. You want to make sure the CPU is actually running code. And I always talk about this in my videos. You want to check, you know, the reset circuit. You want to check that there's activity on the data bus and the address bus. If you don't see activity on your CPU, well, there's no way it's going to run the ROM code to initialize the, you know, blue screen and run BASIC, right? So it's like that all comes down to thinking about how the computer is working and what you can eliminate, and that makes solving problems much easier. And going back to that Commodore PET that I was showing before, when you turned it on, it would generate some, you know, bunch of random characters on the screen. But I remember, I didn't really understand this at the time, but I started reading about how the computer worked. You know, and it's had really good documentation from Commodore. And with the Universal PET, I'm sure Dan knows this very well, the first thing it does is it has to initialize the video chip to even display anything at all. So the fact is, when I turn on my PET, I had garbage on the screen, but that meant the CPU was running, and it was executing part of the ROM, and then it was getting stuck, obviously. But that, again, that garbagey screen told me a lot, and in hindsight, I know a lot more than I did then. I know a lot more now. That eliminated a bunch of things. And back then, I didn't know that as much, so I was like thinking, oh, the CPU is bad, and, you know, whatever, I was changing all sorts of parts, and, you know, I was kind of doing the Parts Canon, I think, to some extent on that machine. But that skill is now enabling me, that kind of thinking. If you can train your brain to think that way, it's actually weirdly helpful in everything in life. And I'm not a car mechanic, but I know my way around a car. And those same exact skills actually do a lot for helping me with fixing my car, or working on my car, or working on the like my house electrical system. Like my AC broke the other day, so did Dan's. And it just stopped running, right? And I was like, oh, instead of calling the AC people to come out, I was like, well, let me think about this. I walked outside. I could see that the fan was running, because the thermostat would tell it to start, the fan would run, but I didn't hear the compressor. So I was like, okay, I know my thermostat's good. It's turning on the AC outside, but the fan runs, but I hear no compressor. Well, that means, I mean, I'm sure if anyone knows anything about AC will know right away what that is, but there are just a couple problems that could be. Dead compressor, bad contactor, which is what gives power to the compressor, or a bad run capacitor for bad cap. But my AC is from 2016 is when I put my AC in, because Oregon, you don't really need AC until more recently. And of course, as I said, new capacitors are freaking garbage. So I took my cap out of the AC unit, which I looked at a video online, easy peasy. I got my little cap tester, you know, that I use inside, and yeah, sure enough, 35 microfarad was 30 picofarads. I'm like, well, the motor's not going to run with that. So I went down to the hardware store, picked up a new one. Yes, things started right up. But again, it was like, you know, if anyone knows AC, there are lots of things that can go wrong between, you know, your thermostat, there's a condensate pump inside my house that pumps the extra water out, and if that were bad, it wouldn't turn on the outside unit. So going out and seeing the fan running told me that it's none of those things. I didn't even need to check that stuff. I could go right to the problem. And it's exactly the same with these computers. So here's a CRT block diagram from an old TV, not a Commodore. It's like old school. I'll run through a couple exercises here of this whole thing. I hope I'm not beating a dead horse here, but imagine you turn on your old television, like something you bought at a thrift store for $5, and you plug in a VCR into the RF input in the back, but you get no picture. You get a white snowy image with static on the speaker. Well, right away, use my mouse pointer here. So right away with the CRT here, you have an image. It's snowy, but you have an image, and it's taking up the full picture. Well, it's not the flyback transformer that generates the high voltage. It's not the horizontal and vertical part that's like moving the beam around, right? You can kind of just ignore this stuff. It's not the sync separator, because again, if that weren't working, you wouldn't have any horizontal or vertical. It's not the audio amp. You hear the static. It's not the video amplifier. Like you just keep ruling stuff out. It's not the power supply because it's generating an image. The problem's got to live in this area up here. The tuner, the IF amplifier, possibly the demodulator. It could be the power supply not giving the right voltage just to the tuner or something. But point being, you can just zero right in on this section of the TV. And even if you don't have the schematics, yes?
You gotta check to make sure it's on the right channel.
Yeah, well, you do have to check it's on the right channel. That's a good one. And it's plugged in, because I've done that where I'm like, oh, there's no picture, and like, oh, the cable's it's not in the back. Point being is like that process elimination is 100% the way I work, and I've been able to like fix a bunch of monitors and stuff because I am a huge addict of CRTs. I was talking to a viewer the other day, or yesterday I think it was, and CRTs that we have on Earth now are all that we're ever going to have. That's it, right? They're not making any more ever again, and they are consumable. And I've talked about this a whole bunch, and I'm going on a tangent here. The CRT here is a consumable item in that as you use it, it's used up, and then that's that. There is no more facilities left on the planet to rebuild those, which did used to exist. They could actually like take the electron gun off and put a new one on. Those facilities are just gone. And it's funny to think, and this is actually an interesting thing. This has to do with like anything technological, but car parts or anything where they're like, you know what, how come they can't just make more? Like in the 70s or 60s or 50s they were making this stuff. We could do that now. It's 2023. The thing is, like, the tooling and the mechanical knowledge about how to run the machines that made this stuff is gone. Not that we couldn't reinvent the CRT today. We could. But the folks that ran at the manufacturing plant, they've all retired. They've passed on. The machinery that made the CRTs, they're gone. So there's just no way to fix this stuff. And the same goes for like your whatever in your whatever appliance or car or whatever the part that's gone. Unless some company gets hold of the old equipment to make it again, it's gone. So because of that, I'm an addict and I love collecting CRTs. They're heavy and big and they take up a lot of space. But for me, using a retro computer, it really feels authentic to me to see the image on the computer or on the device it was designed for. So anyways, that is one of the reasons why I learned to fix CRTs, because these things break all the time too. And it's not always the CRT itself that's worn out, but there's all sorts of other components. But this troubleshooting process that I'm always talking about, I've fixed monitors. I have had all sorts of issues in the CRT that have been in various areas. Like I've had a video amplifier that was bad on an Apple monitor once, and it was just a transistor. And again, the monitor turned on, generated, I could hear it running, I could feel static on the screen, so I knew it was making high voltage, but I plugged the video in and it was just nothing. So I was able to, I could ignore, I didn't have an audio amplifier, but I could ignore this whole horizontal vertical because I knew that was working, because I could turn the brightness up and I could see, there was a little bit of a dim image there. We're good. The problem had to lie in the video amplifier, and it didn't take me that long to kind of use my oscilloscope and just trace along. And I'm like, oh, here's the video signal from my whatever test signal, and it just stopped. And there was a transistor. I took it out, put in my little Chinese, $10 tester. It was bad. So that methodology takes me far, and that is exactly how I fix everything. And if you watch my videos, as I'm sure a lot of you do, I actually at this point get really sad when I take a part out that's not bad. Like I'm really like maybe I'm like I love the Japanese culture. I'm like, oh, I'm so sorry for suspecting you as being the problem, and you were actually good. I'll put you back in. I don't want to, I take stuff out where in a way I can always reinstall it on the board, and I do put the original part back in, even though I could. People are like, just put a new one in. I'm like, I'd rather put the original back in. It's probably better quality anyways. So yeah, I mean, that's it. And this is a Commodore 1084. Again, this is from a Commodore 1084 schematic. And while it looks complicated, all of the things you need to, once you've like isolated where the problem might lie, and going back to that CRT block diagram, imagine you have a monitor and it has a vertical line just across, or horizontal line across the screen, right? There's no up and down deflection of the electron beam. Well, you can just like ignore almost all of this complexity and focus in on, like, I think it's right here. This is like the vertical size, like a little potentiometer that controls the vertical size. You just start looking around over here. And if the little potentiometer broke or is bad, a lot of times with the CRTs, and obviously this comes from experience, it won't have any deflection because that little pot is not working. And without that pot working right there, so it says on there, you can't read it, but it says like, it's a 1K or 10K or whatever. You poke it with your multimeter and you're like, oh, it's bad. Let me pop a new one in. And occasionally it's really hard to find those because, it's made them in 40 years or whatever. I'll put a little resistor in there, a 5K, and like, boop, there we go. We have an image again. And so, yeah, so it's all kind of down to that. Now, sometimes, this is a TRS-80 Model 2. You can be led down a very difficult path. And that machine is a very complicated machine with a lot of cards and a chassis. It's very difficult to troubleshoot because you can't run the machine in a way where you can probe on the boards. 64 is really easy, or an Apple II. That thing really was difficult for me. And in the end, the way I got this computer fixed, I made videos about this, so you can, if you haven't seen those videos, I asked a friend, David, a local viewer in Portland, who was good at assembly, to write a diagnostic ROM for this computer. And no one had ever made a diagnostic ROM for the Model 2 ever. It has a very simplistic diagnostic when you turn it on, and it was passing no problem. It would start to boot, and the computer would just boot and then do all sorts of weird things, like you would type on the keyboard and you'd get random characters, and it would crash randomly, all sorts of stuff like that was happening. So I was like, well, I don't know what's wrong with this machine, and I had spent so many hours, not on camera, but I just spent hours fixing it. So he wrote this diagnostic ROM for me, and we partnered on it. Like, I read the schematics and documentation, looked how to figure out how to do bank switching because it supports different banks. And anyways, we came up with this ROM. It's on my GitHub, so if you want to ever run it, I put it on there. And what this started doing is it was running through the RAM tests, and it was passing, it was working. You turn on the computer, it's immediately start testing the RAM. But as it switched between the different banks of RAM, the floppy drive would start accessing. And again, this is where I'm talking about like paying attention to like what it's doing and being able to get clues from that. I was like, the RAM banking, which uses an I/O port on the Z80, has nothing to do with the floppy drive controller, period. And in fact, it would often crash while it was doing the RAM banking. It was like doing weird things. But if I took the disk controller out, it would work. But the original built-in diagnostics on this computer from Radio Shack, you couldn't run the boot diagnostic without the disk controller. It would fail right away. It'd be like disk controller error. But our ROM didn't require the disk controller. So it would run perfectly without the disk controller. But when it was plugged in, the disk light was coming off and on. And I'm like, what's going on? This doesn't make any sense. So I had to think what was going on. And I went, wait a second. To control the RAM bank, you access an I/O port. And that's how you switch the banks. And the disk drive controller, as on all Z80 or Intel processors, is uses these I/O addresses. If you ever use DOS PCs, you'll know that base I/O 220. That's a way for the processor to communicate to I/O peripherals, and the Z80 works exactly the same way. Anyways, I thought, okay, wait a second. So it's changing RAM banks, and it's making the disk drive controller go. So the problem has got to be on the disk controller, and specifically, it's got to be where the disk controller is somehow being triggered, like the disk controller thinks it's being talked to when it's actually the processor talking to the RAM bank switching. So sure enough, you look at the schematic and there's all this complex TTL logic, but you can see it's labeled IO select or whatever, and you start going through, and I was like, well, it's got to be something over here. So I started looking at the chips, and again, I couldn't troubleshoot this. I can't run the computer while it's plugged in. But what I did is I just thought about the problem. I thought, okay, here's a chip here involved in IO selecting the disk drive. Let me take it out of the board. I did, and I put it in my tester. I think it was the Mini Pro, which is a little Chinese tester. And sure enough, that was the problem. what was happening is that chip in the disk controller was turning on for anytime anything accessed an I/O address, the disk controller thought it was being talked to. So when you typed down a key on the keyboard, it would also, the disk controller would go, oh, it's talking to me. And it would try to like talk back on the address on the CPU bus, on the data bus, and that was causing a bus conflict. And that's why I was getting random characters. That's why I was getting crashing. That's why the light was coming out with the banking. So it was one chip, and this diagnostic led me right to that just by paying attention to what was happening, using my eyes and my ears and my senses. Your senses take you a long way once you kind of think about how things work. And in the end, I was so ecstatic to get this thing working. And I don't know if I would have done it without this diagnostic ROM. So what the moral of this story is, occasionally you do have to write some diagnostic ROM for yourself to try to test the problem. And I learned that from my friend Frank. He's an Italian electrical engineer that I'm good friends with, who is a master at fixing the most complicated things you can only imagine. Like these arcade boards that are like from the 70s, like sandwich full of TTL chips. He will learn to write the assembly language to test the specific problem. And he's the one who kind of got us on this path of doing this. So anyways, that's my final little tidbit, is that basically sometimes you gotta take extreme measures to fix stuff, and even I've had to do that. But it really comes down to using your senses and your brain more than anything else, and then knowing the very basics about using an oscilloscope, multimeter, reading the schematics. You can pretty much fix anything. Anyways, that is it. Thank you. Yes, obviously we're at 55 minutes, so I don't know, Earl, like we have to be out of here at a certain time.
Go for a few questions.
Okay, question?
I just want to say thank you for sharing your mistakes.
Yes.
Because that's where we get to learn.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I mean, I don't sugarcoat the repair process, and you know, it's very easy when you're doing repair videos to like leave stuff out. I mean, I have to edit for time, I have to be honest, but when I make a mistake that takes me down a total wrong path, I always try to leave that in, and because it is a learning process, and it's the reality of doing this work, especially when you're not super experienced. Once you become like master level, like those folks who fix TVs in those TV repair shops back in the old days, they were so experienced. They could be like, oh, it's got to be this, that, you know, and they would zoom right in because they were doing volume, right? They had to fix TVs and get them in and out. Obviously, with this computer stuff, it's a labor of love, but I am definitely still learning. And what the real moral here is that I started doing this in 2018, and it's 2023, so it hasn't been that many years, whether like 6 years or whatever. And I feel I've gotten pretty far, and I really feel that like anyone in here could do the same thing. So, any other questions? Yes?
I do appreciate that, lost my train of thought. I do appreciate that you'll take, any old oscilloscope or any new oscilloscope or just let's try and fix it with that. I want to see more people doing that.
Yeah, there's a lot of like test equipment snobbery, let's just say, where people will go like, oh, that scope is crap. It's like Chinese junk or whatever. I mean, yeah, it's not good, but it's enough to fix a 1 megahertz Commodore 64. You're not going to be fixing some like Ryzen whatever 5 gigahertz computer now with that stuff. But with the where we are with right to repair right now, I don't even really know where we're going to be in the future. The real difference was Commodore and a lot of these companies sold chips to independent repair shops to fix these computers. Like, they willingly wanted repair shops to fix things. So there is a bunch of this stuff out there in the world, still to this day. But on this, like, MacBook Air here, like, Apple doesn't want you to fix this thing. And even back in the 80s, Apple didn't want you to fix anything either. So they never released any chips. So an Apple IIe's got a bunch of custom chips on there. None of those were ever released to anyone ever to fix. There would have been a company somewhere in Apple, contracted with, or maybe they did themselves to fix these IIe's. But no Apple dealer was ever repairing an Apple IIe except for swapping the motherboard. And so, unfortunately, Apple has, like, taken the whole industry there with it. It's not like they're the only offenders, but it is sad for me because I am not envying the people who are alive today this is their retro computer, this MacBook Air here, and, like, what are they going to do in 30 years when this thing is dead? I have no idea. I don't know how changing a cap with some leak schematics, sure, but I don't know how you're going to find a replacement custom chip in this thing. You never will. Yeah, I mean, even he complains because he's just like, I can't get those chips. They don't sell them to me. So.
You get someplace over in Europe.
Yeah, it's like illicit, illegal channels. And it's sad because in the 70s, they wanted you to work on the computer. You open an Apple II Plus, every chip is in a socket. They literally were like, yeah, hack it. And that was that book, the Apple Circuit Description. Amazing book. I mean, not written by Apple, but talked about every detail about how the Apple II Plus worked and the Apple II Original 2. Amazing. Like anyone at home, any hobbyist could dig in and mod their computer, add lowercase and whatever. I mean, we're so far from that now, but at least, we exist in that retro space right now where we're able to fool around with this old stuff and hopefully fix it. Yes?
Yeah, I'll just add the comment. My dad's cassette deck in '78, the regular owner's manual had the schematics in the back.
Yeah. Yeah.
Even the service manual.
It's funny, I mean, even like, TVs and stuff, it was very easy to get that stuff. And then Sam's Photo Facts, which is something I reference all the time, right? This is a way to get schematics for these old machines. They would reverse engineer and publish all this stuff. And it's funny in a way, keep in mind, if anyone's doing the repair stuff, a lot of public library systems, not the one in Portland, unfortunately, but I've seen a bunch of other cities, if you're a member of the library, they have access to the entire Sam's Photo Facts database, everything. So if I have to go buy a Sam's schematic because it's not available on Git or anywhere online, it's $12 or whatever, and I'll just pay that, usually for like a TV or a stereo or whatever. But if you're ever repairing something, check with your local library system. They may have like a bulk access thing where you can just use your login and get any of that stuff. Because I've seen that online Googling around. So that's a good resource. Yes.
One of the things, I feel pretty comfortable with the digital side of it.
Yeah.
But once you get over 5 volts, like the monitors, to me, it's like, I'd be terrified to put my scope on there. How do you get over that kind of piece to work with the monitor side?
Right.
It's kinda interesting.
Yeah, the question was like, how do you learn to like get over the fear of high voltages, especially like testing it and stuff while things are running? I think with some experience, like I don't really make tutorials on how to work on high voltage stuff because it's probably some amount of liability for me. But also, I'm no expert either, so I don't like want to give bad advice. But the reality is there are some basics you want to learn about when you're working on high voltage stuff. And one of them is oscilloscopes that you have plugged into the wall. Almost always the ground lead is connected to your ground of your house. And your ground of your house is the same thing as the neutral line. So if you take, you try to measure your 120 volts in the outlet, and you plug like, one part of your oscilloscope into one leg and the other one into the other, if you have it the wrong way, you will literally create a short circuit between ground and live or hot. So point being is that battery powered scopes, like the one I was showing there, are really useful for that kind of things because as long as you're not plugged into USB or anything, you're on battery, you're not creating any kind of connection between what you're testing and the house earth, the ground. But also, on AliExpress, for a very low amount of money, you can buy 100-to-1 oscilloscope probes. And for anyone's not familiar, like when you have a 10x probe or 10-to-1 probe, what happens is when you plug it into 10 volts, what the oscilloscope sees is actually 1 volt. It like divides it by 10. And so the oscilloscope will recalculate what is showing on screen for the voltage. But if you get a 100-to-1 probe, it's doing that by 100. So if you plug it into the 100 volts on your monitor, the oscilloscope's seeing 1 volt. And that just means it's a little less sketchy for your oscilloscope. And definitely if you're probing around on a TV set, there can be thousands of volts. I mean, I'm not talking about like the 25,000 volts, but even on like the neck, there could be thousands of volts. But if you probe 3,000 volts, that's only 30 volts is that 3? It's 3 volts, right? Yeah, so it's much easier on your scope. So I recommend 100-to-1 probe, battery-powered scope, and the final thing is, of course, an isolation transformer. And what those do is transformers are galvanically isolated, so that's just the way they work. They use magnetic fields to connect two sources together. And when you have an isolation transformer, that means that your TV or whatever power supply has no reference to your house power at all. And I haven't tested this personally, but theoretically, you could touch that, like with one hand, and there is no path from that high voltage to ground. Like if you're sitting on, your feet are on the ground and you touch something high voltage, you get a shock because it, goes through you.
When you're ready to test that, make sure the video's running.
Yeah. I mean, the funny, there's some videos about people like my worst shock. I've actually never been shocked by. I mean, I've gotten. Well, I don't believe in that stuff, but I've certainly gotten little zaps. But just wearing like gloves, even those like medical or work, those thin gloves, that offers some amount of protection because you could just brush your hand against something inside there, and and then you might flinch and pull back, and of course knock something over or hit your, whatever. But just having that thin rubber is enough to keep that brush from happening. So, but the isolation transformer, they're not expensive, they're not super common, but you look around, you can find them. And a viewer sent one to me actually, so I use the isolation transformer when I'm working on that high voltage stuff. But I think you just kind of get, if you watch these old videos of the people assembling TVs in factories, like back in the old days, you'll see they're just like, there's like workers on the line, and they're like putting their hands, it's all running while they're like adjusting things, and they just have their hands right in there. But I think a lot of that's from experience, and then they're on isolation transformers, and they just know where to not grab onto. So it comes with experience. I think people overblow. It's overblown, like the danger of working inside a CRT, and not to like minimize that there is danger, but to be honest, it's more dangerous to touch 120 volts in your house because that's got like 100 amps of current behind it. Well, depending on like what circuit breaker you have, but even 15 amp circuit, that's a lot of power. I mean, you can see it, like it can heat water on, in a kettle or whatever. So if that's flowing through you, that's bad. But a CRT, I mean, it doesn't have a lot of current behind it, and you'll get a zap, but if it's off and there's stored charge, it just hurts, but it's gone. Once it's gone, it's gone. So yeah, I don't know, it doesn't really help, I'm sure, but
Well, no, I mean, just having the battery, scope, and the isolation transformer, that gives me a start.
that's it.
It's just, it's
Yeah.
like you said, just getting a little experience with it.
Yeah. Whenever I work on them now, monitors, I always use my little battery power scope. I use the Handtech one. I think it's one of the ones I just bought and reviewed. And I'm just like, I'll just use this. To be honest, it's convenient because this is the CRT board, and I can just put the scope right there next to it. I don't have to I honestly feel there's a danger when you're testing things if you have to keep looking away to look at something, because if you have your probe on there and you look over here, you might slip. But if it's in your field of vision, it's just a lot easier to keep your hand steady and not probe the wrong thing. So.
Do you ever use a discharge tool for your CRTs?
Okay, so yeah, for discharging CRTs, I have a high voltage probe which I bought off eBay for $30 or whatever. It measures the voltage. That has a 1 megohm resistance, and I actually just stick that into the CRT anode, and I can just watch the voltage go away. So I use that to discharge a CRT. And that, because it visually gives me the indication on the meter that it's totally discharged, and it also doesn't zap because it has a 1 megohm resistance. So, any other questions? No? Yes?
On occasion, you ever go on a tangent and do something analog with your digital basement?
Well, I mean, certainly working on CRTs is I like to call it the Adrian's analog attic, I guess. Even though I have an attic in my house, but it's not finished, so I can walk around up there, but there's no way to go up in there. I don't really dabble too much in analog because it's analog and digital are very different, and you have to have more of an understanding of how electronics really work in the analog world. But digital is a lot more cut and dry. This is a gate, it's TTL, it's on when it's over this voltage, it's off when it's below this voltage. A lot of the in-between, a lot of the top part doesn't matter. When it's at 5 volts or 4 volts, it's all the same. But in the analog world with base, transistor, bias, this, that, and the other thing, it's far more complicated. And it's something I'm trying to get more into. And I bought the Art of Electronics books. They're thick volumes that just teach you everything about electronics. And I do intend to one day start reading through those to really learn how to fix analog things more. But I'm trying to cut my teeth on power supplies a little bit, switch mode power supplies, and then CRTs, because typically the problems that exist in those are on the analog side. Luckily, both of those things are relatively simple. That's so funny. So people look at a monitor. If you've seen that Bjork video, she's like, it's a tiny city, The reality is, that block diagram I showed back here, even any monitor, not LCD stuff, but any CRT is basically that. And you can find those sections in the schematics. So once you kind of get your brain around how a monitor works, that's why I've fixed monitors plenty of times now without any schematics available because you just figure out like the base, what the blocks are, and then you can just start probing around and looking up a data sheet for a particular chip, and you're like, oh, here's the voltage pin. It's not getting voltage. Okay, there's a problem somewhere else, that kind of thing. And power supplies are the same thing. Switch mode power supply, the old ones all work pretty much exactly the same way. So, yeah. Any other questions? I think we're over a little bit, but.
The next talk's not till once, we got a little bit.
Oh, okay, we have a bit more time. If anyone. Yes?
So you have a lot of machines go through your basement. What do you do with them afterwards? Because you touched them all right here.
Yeah, the question is what do I do with all these extra machines? I live in a small house. It's only got like 1,700 square feet. And I like to keep part of my house like normal and livable. So like I don't like my bedroom has like nothing retro in it. My living room normally doesn't have anything retro in it. The kitchen, same thing. What I do is when people give stuff to me, because I'm very lucky to have an incredible community that donates machines to me, I don't think it's ethical for me to sell any of that stuff. So I actually give everything away. So there's a set of things I have at home that are like my collection, right? The things that I've always wanted. And like, let's be honest, I didn't even talk about this, but growing up I had my Apple IIc, I had 2GS, VIC20, but I wanted all these other computers. I'd go to friends' houses and they had something else. I'm like, that's so cool. I always wanted that. And in fact, that pet I fixed, that was the first pet I ever used. But I remember there was one in my classroom in 3rd grade. They had a couple in the back, but I was never allowed to use them. And I was like, that's a really cool looking machine. It's like one of the best looking machines ever, in my opinion, just because it's so iconic. And so a lot of what I have at home is me wanting to play around with this old stuff. So I've been slowly kind of accumulating these machines, whether I've been buying them, but now I'm really lucky to have these donations. But look, I have to be honest, I don't need like 30 Commodore 64s or whatever, right? And people love sending those to me, and I love that because I can use them as repairs. And in fact, I have a big pile in the basement that's like all broken stuff. I just test it, put my Post-it note on it, and it goes in the pile. But when I fix them, I do immediately give them away. Now, I don't have time, especially when I was working 2 full-time jobs, regular job plus YouTube, to do any kind of shipping, because people ask me all the time, can I buy one of your machines, whatever. So there's a really big retro community in the Portland area, and I have lots and lots of local viewers, and we get together, and I literally fill up the back of my Subaru and go to our meetups, and I bring it in, and we have a free table. I'm like, please, I do not want anything to come home with me. And I like force people to take everything. So yeah, that's kind of what I do. So it all goes back into the community. So essentially all the folks in Portland don't need to buy retro stuff because I supply the entire community with pets. And I have to say, people always ask me where do I get all this stuff besides donations. A great resource is I recommend learning to get to know your e-waste people, the folks who process e-waste in your area. And Mike's here from Mike Tech, his YouTube channel. He had a big e-waste haul, where he negotiated to be able to buy it. Some of these places will give it to you. It's weird. It varies all over the place. Like some places realize this stuff has value and they want to sell it, or they'll list it on their own store. But some places, and Aaron at Retro Hack Shack, he lives in the Bay Area. He has an e-waste place near him where he'll get like a Amiga 2000 for like $5, because to them, they look at it like a Dell PowerEdge server as something that maybe has some value, but they're like, no, this thing is junk, and maybe it's broken anyways. So they offload. So I actually do get a lot of stuff from local people in the community that like work at those places. Oh, one sec, they give stuff to me because they're just like, hey, you know what? Like we're gonna shred this computer. And we'd rather it at least go to you, where we know you'll make a video about it, and then it'll go on to a better life. Yes?
I took a truck full of CRTs to the e-waste factory, and I said, I think maybe I should avoid going a second time, because they gave me the stink eye after a truck full of burned-in CRTs.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because, what's weird? I have learned, and I was telling this to Mike here, because he's just gotten into this. His channel's only 6 months old, and he is going to be overrun very quickly with stuff. It's very easy to feel, I need to save everything, but unless you own a warehouse, it's just not possible. And the reality is, I've gotten stuff like monitors, like they've saved stuff for e-waste that were like CRTs that had burn-in, and you know, while it works technically, it's dim, it doesn't look good, and I have learned to let that stuff go. And the one place I work with, we call it going back to the farm. So because the place I work with, they all are within, they do everything within Oregon. They properly e-waste and dismantle everything. It doesn't go to China or overseas or whatever. So I don't feel bad like bringing stuff to e-waste, but I will bring back old monitors that are dim and don't work well anymore, because it sucks, because I know people out there are like, they live in a part of the US where there's like nothing, and they're like, I would die for that, but it's just not working well. Now if it's a Commodore monitor, I'll like maybe e-waste everything except save the PCB with those parts on it, because I can like pick a flyback transformer and use it to fix another monitor. But the reality is, like, some VGA monitor that's burned in, I mean, there's a billion of those and whatever. So I have learned to let stuff go, and I recommend you do that too.
About e-waste, let me just tell you a couple of things, because we've run into this here a bit.
Mm.
If a company is certified green, they're not allowed to sell the e-waste. It has to go through the actual e-waste process, be shredded, et cetera, because that's part of the certification. A number of places around here, big electronic places, I've worked in places where I'm like, they have all these old nice monitors that actually would find and burn in, et cetera. They can't even give them to employees.
Yeah, it's,
Because the certification prevents that. And then there's also a liability. We have all the cities around here, which is great. They'll have e-waste every 6 months. John Street will take.
yeah, take everything.
And I said, I've seen gumdrop backs, I've seen other things that I'm like, I can fix that, and they're not allowed to for the liability issue, because if somebody picks something, and they get hurt because of some aspect of it, it would come back to them. So it's great if you've got places that do that, that's wonderful, and I wish more would, but one of the realities in other parts of the country is
Yeah.
they're not allowed to, so
I
I will say, come to the AHCS.
Yeah.
We get lots of stuff coming through from other people that are like, hey, I have this, I can't fix it, or it's past my skills. And, Dan brings it, I said to Jazz, Adrian, and we just get it out.
Yeah.
Who could have fixed it?
Yeah, like if you aren't from the area, if you live in the area, yeah, come to the local meetups here. And if you live somewhere else, try to find your local meetups, because it's a great resource to share and exchange stuff. Like, even if you do barter or whatever with other people, like, I'll trade you this monitor for another thing. But,
Here's our consignment, we do consignment here at the show.
that too.
We're like, here's stuff somebody either can't fix or
Yeah.
doesn't have time, or they've got 60 Commodore 64s, right, whatever it ends up being. Just too much, you can't store it, so.
I will.
share.
The one caveat that for what Earl was saying about, it varies by municipality with the way e-waste works, obviously. But I got to say that, like, some of the places I've interacted with, they use that, oh, we're certified, we can't, as like a way to just get out of actually doing it, because the places I've talked to have all those certifications, and what they care about the most is data destruction. So, like, they don't give me hard drives, they don't give me disks, things that have personal information, but they realize that a monitor, like, they don't need to certify that as destroyed, and they don't sell it to me, they give it to me. So maybe they can't sell it because that's the monetary thing, but they could certainly divert it. And I think it depends on whether they're willing to do it or not. So
Talk to the right people.
yeah, you have to know the right people and prove that you're not just going to be some flipper who's going to just flip it and turn a profit. You're like,
Stick it on eBay.
yeah, they're like, oh no, this is going back to the community, I'm gonna fix this, So obviously I have that. They know me. They watch my channel, so they know that I do that stuff. But yeah. Any other questions? Do we have to leave? Yeah. Wait. Yeah. Go ahead.
Well, I was just gonna say, I work at a certain big box electronics retailer.
Yeah.
It's like blue and yellow.
Oh yeah, I don't know which one. That must be. Yeah, it must be IKEA.
Yeah, that's
Blue and yellow.
and even as an employee there, like the other day, I had a Mac 2CI come in.
Yeah.
For getting like.
They were just like, we don't. Yeah, they didn't want it.
No. Yeah, they didn't want it, but like.
Corporate
I
policy.
could not.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, I couldn't even like try. They were
Yeah.
like, it's technically theft, which.
Yeah. Yeah. Unfortunately.
Very sad.
That's the reality, and I think a lot of corporate policies are just written that way. The e-waste places or retailers or any place like that, same thing. Which is unfortunate, because I know for sure, I can guarantee you 100%, a ton of stuff is getting shredded and destroyed. And it's weird because we all know the value of this stuff, like you see it being sold. But the reality is that a lot of people who aren't in the space we are, they don't see the value. And if their loved one passes away and the house is filled with vintage computers, they're just like 1-800-GOT-JUNK, please take it all. And there was a house in Portland where there was a guy who was like a member of our community. He passed away, no family, I mean, no next of kin, no kids, no wife, or none of that. And luckily, his family, like he had some distant nieces and nephews or whatever, found a note that said, if I die, contact these folks here at the local computer club. And they did, and we were like, we like jumped into action, rented, the house, guys, it was like a 3-bedroom, like kind of ranch house. It was a hoarder situation, but not hoarder as in garbage, technology hoarding. There were like narrow pathways, and we all went in there, and we were just like, we rented trucks, and we all just worked together, and we offloaded everything. The family was very happy because we took out almost everything except for a little bit of trash. So their job of cleaning the house to sell it was mostly done, and then there were hundreds of Macs and Apple IIs, and I mean, rare. Franklin, I have like, you know, some rare computers that I got from that because they're like, oh yeah, just take it. But the reality was they had already arranged pickup for that stuff to just be hauled away to junk. And then they found that note, and then we swooped in and they canceled, and and they worked with us. Yeah, so if you have a collection, get a will and just say, even if your will says, call these people and make sure you pay for them to ship whatever they need and take it all, which is what I need to do, to be honest, because, they're going to go to my house and be like, oh, no. So, yeah. Okay, so we're done.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Adrian's Digital Basement. Oh my god, it freaking works.